Thank you all for social distancing and wearing masks. We're going to go ahead and get started for tonight. I'd like to welcome you to the Andrew P. Keshaviroff building in the Alaska State Museum. We have a special presentation for you tonight that's related to our special exhibit this summer called The Spirit Wraps Around You. It's an exhibit on the history of native weaving on the northern northwest coast, Tlingit, Haida, and Tsimshian weavers. And we have 24 robes, both old and new, on display here for the summer through October 9th. And I encourage you to see the exhibit if you haven't already done so. Tonight we have a presentation about one of the fine pieces that's in the exhibit, this one right here by Master Weaver Kathy Rado of Juneau. She's been weaving since 1985, which was the very beginning of the revival of Raven's Tail weaving. And that's the early tradition of ceremonial textiles on the northern coast that predates Chilkat weaving. And at some point in the early 1800s, it was replaced by Chilkat weaving. So since that time, from early 1800s until the mid 1980s, Raven's Tail wasn't being done, and there was only a dozen robes in existence in museums, mostly in Europe and the east coast of the United States. And in the mid-90s, the weavers revitalized that tradition, and today they're actually a pretty common sight when you go to celebration or native ceremonies. There's so many new robes. But back in the mid-80s, a lot of people had never seen them before, and there was a real energy surrounding the movement to bring them back. And Kathy was a big part of that. She's one of the students who in 1985 was just starting out learning the technique, and she got together with Cheryl Samuel, who was teaching classes at the University of Alaska Southeast. And Cheryl had been able to travel around the world to look at the dozen surviving robes of the old tradition, and she reverse engineered what she saw. She was able to figure out how to weave in that style, and then wrote a book on it and started teaching through the University of Alaska's Native Arts program here at the UAS. And we're extremely lucky that she did that, and there's now, I'm sure, at least 100 weavers that studied with Cheryl that are now producing beautiful new forms of Raven's Tail weaving, either robes, aprons, headdresses, bags, all sorts of items using Raven's Tail. So Kathy, simultaneously with weaving her robe here, she was working on a weaving project at the Alaska State Museum, and she and a group of other weavers, including Kay Parker and Cheryl herself, Dolores Churchill, and about 20 some others that worked on it at various times over the course of a year. They produced a robe for the museum, and that's also on exhibit in the Spirit Wraps Around You. So Kathy is a teacher herself now and has taught children how to weave, elementary school children. And we're very honored to have her to present tonight about her fantastic robe. That's the title of it is One Within Another, and it's one of the early revival period Raven's Tail robes. So if you please join me in welcoming Kathy Rado.
Thank you all for coming in tonight. I'm very pleased to be able to share my love and passion for Raven's Tail, and in particular the Raven's Tail with fur. My name is Kathy Rado. My Haida name is Dooney. I was adopted by Vesta Johnson at the Johnson Totem Pole Raising. Today I'll be telling the story of my robe, One Within Another, and Dolores Churchill gave it the name during a Raven's Tail Weaver gathering we had here in Juneau. And it was named after a basket of the same name, where one basket that's designed goes inside the another basket. And so that's the design on both sides. I have a design on the fur side, I have a design on the back. The first two slides that are coming up are of the old robes in the Leningrad Museum, and they're not in real good condition, but the fur is in great condition. You can see the warps. Unfortunately, they're housed very far away from home in Russia, so I haven't really got to see them or identify the origin of these old robes or the secrets they contain, except what I could discover visually using pictures, slides, and measurements that other people had taken, Cheryl Samuel mostly. The sight of these robes produces a feeling of awe. It really does. The regal robes were at the time the most soft and warmest garment in the world. Sea otter is the softest fur in the world, with up to a million squares per square inch. Even today, there's no synthetic, there's no fabric, there's no anything that's softer than sea otter. The geometric on these designs on these robes are stunning. I'm even more in awe knowing how difficult it is to produce a sea otter fur robe, that they could do the geometric designs on the top and bottom is just difficult. I was tricked into Raven's Tail. One day, one sunny afternoon after I got my wish, my husband had purchased me a used Bernina sewing machine. I was very excited. I was giggling. I was so happy. And suddenly over my shoulder he says, "Now that you have a sewing machine, will you make me a Chilkat blanket?" And I started to say yes, but then I looked over my shoulder and saw that he had a twinkle in his eye, and I said, "If you can make one on a sewing machine." And he said, "No, you can't make one on a sewing machine." He says, "I'll tell you what they are, and I'll show them to you. My cousin Anna Ellers is demonstrating at the State Museum today." So we went down and watched Anna weave, and I saw those strings and the complexity of all the work and the weaving process, and I turned to Pedro and said, "Boy, you really tried to trick me. Jeez." And I told him that I would perhaps, maybe, think about it, possibly, weaving him a Chilkat robe. It looked complicated. I knew it would take me years to learn Chilkat weaving. I was not convinced he was ever going to get a Chilkat robe. Pedro and I lived in Juneau. Pedro was raised in Ketchikan. He ran into a Haida friend of his, Carrie Sykes, who came for dinner one night, which began our friendship. As she was leaving, she stopped, looked me intensely in the eye, and said, "You will come to my house and learn to weave." And then she left. So I went to her house and learned to weave. She taught me to weave with cedar. I sat down and wove a basket that night and completed it, and I won an apprenticeship with Carrie, who took me spruce fruit gathering and peppering, and then weaving with baskets, and then we went to Ketchikan and we did cedar bark gathering and preparation and made baskets, and then Carrie and I went to the first weavers gathering together, where I met Dolores Churchill, who helped me quite a bit in my research, encouraging me, and I took a lot of weaving classes from her. As I became closer with Carrie's family, her grandmother, Vesta Johnson, adopted me as her sister, at the totem pole raising in Ketchikan. And then I was fine at home, and one day, Carrie brought this book by, The Raven's Tail by Cheryl Samuel. She had just purchased it and was proud of it. She turned to the page of One Within the Other. She mentioned the controversy about the type of fur used in these robes. I immediately knew it was sea otter because of watching the cuts when my husband was doing them and seeing how many, seeing the way the furs were and how many flew when how hard they were to vacuum. And suddenly, while looking at the picture, the strangest thing happened. I had a vision. I had a vision of my hands in a robe, holding them, and it was tactile as well as visual. I have never in my life, before or after, had this experience, and it was overwhelmingly told me I was going to do this thing. I turned to my husband and said, when it faded, and said, "Would you accept one of these robes instead of a Chilkat robe?" And he quickly said yes. And so I immediately replied, "I need to go to Russia. I need to go to Russia now." Both Carrie and Pedro said, "Russia? Russia, Russia?" And I said, "Yeah, that's where the robes are. I'm going to have to learn from them." And at this moment, if I'd known how difficult the task would be, I would have not have been as cheerful in my delight in avoiding Chilkat weaving. Not feeling Russia was feasible, Carrie said, "Wait, the lady who wrote the book is coming to town and giving a lecture. You can talk to her about it." So I immediately signed up for Cheryl's class, attended her lecture, and after the first class, I understood I didn't know enough to weave on my own. It was really frustrating. I was frustrated by my lack of knowledge and stunned that I couldn't pick it up quicker, because I'm a quick learner. This would not stand. I had to weave that robe. So I made a plan. I would complete my project faster by attending classes with Cheryl, so I followed her. 2 years and 6 classes later, following Cheryl to Juneau, Ketchikan, and Sitka, I was just about ready. It took me an additional 2 years to weave that darn robe for my husband. Pedro took on the role of patron and cheerfully paid my bills. Fortunately, I stayed at Bertha Karras's bed and breakfast in Sitka, which was in walking distance of the classes. And I lived in Juneau and had a house in Ketchikan, so I could afford, even though we were poor, to do this traveling and follow Cheryl around and learn the technique. After 3 years of learning the raven's tail technique and researching the sea otter robes, I started weaving, and it took me about 2 years to get it done, so it took me 5 years to complete the project. It may have been quicker to learn Chilkat weaving like Pedro first requested. To help me with my project, Cheryl gave me copies of her research that included slides taken in Russia. So I lacked an excuse to go on my very super important trip to Russia. It's a dream of mine to meet the old sea otter robes and see what they have to tell me, because I just need to go there. One of the hardest part of weaving this robe was to respect the knowledge that I learned by doing it and disregard the experts. With no disrespecting their knowledge or an expertise, unfortunately, Dolores Churchill encouraged my research. I knew the weaving was so ancient that there weren't any living people to teach me. And I already had a big dispute about what type of fur was used to weave them. So it was correcting that misconception that let me be able to do the robe. It was mistakenly identified as marten fur when it was indeed sea otter fur. Then Cheryl and the other weavers told me I was weaving the robe wrong. A good researcher follows the evidence, regardless of the findings. My vision held me up and told me I would complete the robe successfully. It's a comforting feeling knowing that you're going to succeed before you start. My breakthrough that helped me identify the correct weaving technique came by means of an overheard conversation. I heard Dolores Churchill tell a cedar weaving student, "You are in charge of your materials. You control them to do your will." And it sounded real simple, and I didn't think about it right away. And then I realized I was intimidated by the materials I was working with. And I changed my attitude. And it solved my problem. All of my weaving training had to be modified to weave with the fur warp successfully. I learned to weave with the fur. Weaving with sea otter fur is a symmetrical arrangement. It's pleasing to the eye, and it's very hard on the body. It's not easy to do, but it is very easy to do wrong. I had help along the way, creating and weaving this robe. My husband cut the sea otter fur strips. My student at the time, Kay Parker, helped me scale the bottom design called Teeth of the Killerwhale. Cheryl made a design for the robe called Northern Lights that's on the top. Dolores wove on the robe while learning to weave with fur. At the start of weaving my robe, I attended the second Weavers Gathering at the Totem Heritage Center in Ketchikan. It was at this gathering that we formed the Raven's Tail Weavers Guild. During this event, I gave a lecture on preparing the warps, cutting the warps and preparing them for hanging the strips and starting the robe. And the main feature of my lecture was a video of Pedro cutting the strips and showing him how to stretch. My lecture was successful, but the next day at the gathering, one agent and 4 fish and wildlife officers in full uniform carrying guns came into the Totem Heritage Center to seize my robe. They split up, fanned out, and came to where my robe had been located the day before. By chance, the robe and I were elsewhere at the time of the raid. After storing the robe safely away, I continued attending the gathering despite a wonderful offer from the people of Metlakatla to shelter me in the robe until my robe was completed. I was quite moved by their generous offer as the community voted to provide me and the robe shelter. And that felt really warm to me. At this time, I felt it was wise to retain a lawyer. I hired Jim Bruce of Ketchikan. While I was telling my lawyer my sad raven's tale, Jim's wife Krista fed me the most delicious meal that nurtured my stressed soul. To this day, I cannot recall what I ate, only the feeling. Jim finally said, "Okay, you're here to do a lecture. I get that. Let's get to the point. I understand. What are the officers trying to charge you with?" It took quite a bit of discussion to convince my lawyer that the crazy officers want to arrest me on a weaving felony. My opinion was that Pedro owned the robe, and if it was going to be taken and seized, it was going to be taken from my husband, not me. I was upset at this bizarre turn of events, so I went home to Juneau. A few days later, fish and wildlife officers came to my house. In true Alaska form, the officers had to crawl over a pile of newly delivered wood. It was -4 degrees Fahrenheit and windy. They were grossly underdressed in their press. The lead officer demanded I surrender the robe immediately. The robe start was packed in cedar chips in a box at my feet because I had expected this visit by this time, once I understood what they were up to. When the officer arrived, I asked if they had a search warrant. He said, "No, and if you make me get one, I will charge you with a felony with a possible 2 years in jail and a $20,000 fine." I left them waiting on the porch and called my lawyer, had a very nice long talk. My lawyer said I was well within my rights to make a robe for my husband for ceremonial purposes. So I returned to the officers and said, "I believe I am operating within the provisions of the Marine Mammal Protection Act, and I will not surrender my robe to you now. I have it. It's here in my house. If you come back with a search warrant, I will give it to you." The lead officer made several angry, unprofessional statements I will not repeat at this time. He may have been cold and cranky. I left them to climb back over the pile of wood in the frigid morning. The officers never came back. My lawyer spoke with the authorities, who informed him charges were not going to be pressed. Once the dust settled from the incident at the gathering, the robe weaving went along smoothly. I finished the robe in 1991. At the same time, I became a new mom of a beautiful 2-year-old daughter. This slowed my weaving career significantly. I became a teacher of elementary student weavers as I began to develop children's weaving projects. As if learning a new weaving technique and reviving an ancient weaving form wasn't enough, I had several students during this time teaching basic raven's tail. One day, Joni Lewis showed up with a Chilkat project with hung warp, no design, and no teacher. So to keep ahead of her, Joni, I taught myself Chilkat design and weaving using Cheryl's book, and stayed ahead of her one class and got her finished her project. Now in my twilight years, I am once again able to focus on my vision. I am currently preparing a second raven's tail robe. Although considering how hard it is on one's body to weave these robes correctly, it is likely this will be my last sea otter robe I weave. Thus, I am seeking students so the knowledge may be carried on. The experts who taught me, Carrie Sykes, my dear friend, taught me cedar gathering, weaving, spruce roots. Dolores Churchill was a big supporter, and the wisdom of material control was a blessing. Cheryl Samuel gave me all of her information freely and encouraged me to succeed. Chris McNeil Jr. gave me the oral history that told me I was on the right path. Dorka Jackson taught me Chilkat weaving, and Rita Blumenstein was supportive and taught me natural dyes and basketry weaving. So the robe itself, the materials are merino wool with sea otter and leather for the ties. The sea otter is cut into strips and used as warps. Every third warp is a wool warp in the center of the design field. I used black, white, yellow, red, and brown merino wool for the weft, and merino for the wool warps and sea otter strips for the down. Sea otter was used for the collar. The designs include the boxes of daylight and the center main design. As mentioned previously, the top border is the Northern Lights design, and the bottom border is the teeth of the killer whale. It's a design from Sitka that's usually used on baskets. The design on the edge is the mouth track of the woodworm, which is a traditional Kagwantan design. So these robes had quite a range historically. They, in 1791, during the time of first contact, First Malaspina described collecting a robe in Yucatan. I don't know if that's one of the robes in Russia or not. The same year, Mashand saw a fur robe in Sitka. In 1792, Captain Kamano viewed another robe on his travels in Sitka. Vancouver saw a fur robe used on Prince of Wales Island by the Haidas. Lewinsky saw one in Sitka and another fur robe in 1804. Through the 1790s to 1805, the ship captains reported seeing these fur-warped robes throughout Southeast, ranging from Yakutat, Lituya Bay, Sitka, and then south to Prince of Wales. The Haida Tlingit and Nootka people were reported to have used these rare robes. Additionally, Chris McNeil Sr. shared a story about his Nishka grandmother weaving sea otter raven's tail fur. When he was a child, Chris felt the robe, the fur, the warps, and he had tears in his eyes from the tactile memory. Crisp memory provided sound reassurance, and my vision and path were correct. These rare and beautiful robes appear to have not been widely produced after a series of pandemics wiped out 80% of all Alaska natives. Further, the rules for weaving these valuable robes were constricting. Only high caste people could weave, and the knowledge was very protected. It was very secretive. Only your apprentice got to see it. You covered it up when anybody else was around. It was like a guild. It was a craft that was held real close. And with the 80% die-off, the small minority of weavers that did it probably perished. After that, the die-offs, all the adding to the challenge, sea otters were being hunted at a rate that was not sustainable or culturally acceptable. Any surviving weavers would have discontinued using sea otter as the material was no longer available or sustainable. The survivors of the pandemics formed new villages for cultural survival. Though through death and intentional colonization, cultural knowledge was lost. This Chilkat robe naturally rose into popularity. The new ability to use farmline designs within the cheat weaving made the Chilkat weaving even more alluring. And the last advice I have here is know the laws. I read the law real carefully before I started weaving the robe for my husband, and I knew that I was following the law. They change the provisions all the time. And if you're thinking of weaving something or working with any kind of sea otter, look up the newest version to make sure you're in the green. And now I have time if anyone has any questions. Hi. Can you approach the mic, please, so we can hear you?
I just want to say thank you for this. It's incredible. I have a question about a robe, a piece of the raven's robe that they found in Sitka on a mountaintop. Are you familiar with that? They were doing some kind of road work, and then they found.
I believe Steve is familiar with.
No?
Was that the one Janny worked on?
Well, they found a piece and it was old, and then they took it to Sheldon Jackson, and that's where I saw it.
I don't know of any that was found on a mountaintop.
Well, not a mountain. It was right in town. Anyways,
Oh, I believe Janice Criswell worked on the piece found there. Yeah, and is it here in the museum?
Yeah.
Oh, it is. Is that the pieces?
The fragments?
The old pieces that are there? Ah, thank you.
Good question. I didn't know those were the old pieces myself. Yeah.
So I've lived in Alaska a long time, and this is the first time I've seen this particular kind of robe, this design. So it's sort of humbling to have this opportunity to hear you talk about it and to see it up close. I'm curious what kind of event, ceremony, opportunity a person would attend and participate in and wear this kind of robe. And did Pedro ever get a chance to wear it?
He wore it he tried it on a few times, but he didn't dance it before he perished. He died quite young. I've worn it at celebrations. It's been worn at potlatches, kuis, different ceremonial events by myself and by others that have permission for me to use it. It doesn't get out much. It mostly lives in my closet, but its really big outing was here at the museum.
So to store it safely, so it doesn't fall apart, so the fur is kept.
So you're wondering how I store it safely?
Yeah.
Samsonite.
Oh my God.
I should have something better, but I've got a Samsonite suitcase. It fits in a little briefcase. It fits in really well. Ideally, 50% humidity is what they're supposed to be kept at to keep and you keep them out of the heat. I've never taken it down south. I will not take it down south. It is too hot. I don't know what would happen to the leather. I know that if unoiled, some leathers will deteriorate. But most furs used to be kept in refrigerated places, and then you'd go out and check out your fur and go out in the evening. So I'm a little concerned about heat, but besides that, it's fine.
Will your current project include sea otter?
Oh, yes. I'm going to make a second robe with sea otter warps. And that's why it's going to be my last, because it's really hard on the hands, it's hard on the neck, it's hard on the back. It's incredibly difficult to do right. And if you're trying it and you think it's easy, you're probably not doing it right.
And will that be a robe also?
It'll be larger. I'm going to make it to scale for me. This was made to scale for my husband, who was traditionally built. And I'm a bit taller and skinnier, so I probably need a different size. The usual measurements from wrist to wrist, and then you can fold it and it wears well. Yeah. Yeah.
What are warps?
Warps are the ones that go straight up and down, where the wefts are the ones that weave across. But
So do you weave all the light colored stuff and then take some of the darker yarn-like stuff and weave it in the thing, or do you do it all together?
you do it one row at a time. Weaving raven's tail is like weaving a basket, except for it's flat and doesn't keep going around. You start at one end, you stop at the other. You start another row and you stop at the other. You insert the design as you go on that row, flip them up out of the way, weave under them, keep braiding down as you go until you got that much weaving and you have enough to close your boxes. And then you weave across the bottom. And at the end of each box is where I have the little braid that hangs down. But the center of each box has the little yellow braid you may see on the front. I don't know if it's visible. Yeah. Probably. Oh yes, one of those. Yeah. So.
So is it hard to keep it a special union within all the size of the boxes? Is it hard to keep that size and then the next one about the same other size? And
No, the
pretty
warps pretty much tell you.
Do you use a ruler or something to separate so you know how far to make it? Because it's not crooked, it's straight, you know?
No, I just did it by eye mostly. Now and then you take a ruler and straighten it out if you think it's wonky, but after enough weaving, you just know how to, it's the spacing, you know.
Question about the design.
Okay.
The colors in the raven's tail are largely the tan and the black. And you've included a red strip in there. Is there significance including that red strip, or was it just show it?
It was the Northern Light exhibit that Cheryl saw. It was a beautiful Northern Lights, and then it had a burst of red at the end. And so she went on her design, she had a burst of red at the end. But brown, it wasn't normally used. I used brown because it complemented the weaving, and I actually thought that the old robes were brown because all my slides showed them brown. Cheryl told me later that the dyes had faded and they were black. Oh, whoops, that's one of the problems working with slides instead of, you know. But I like the brown. I think it goes well with the tan robe.
So you're gonna do black this time or brown?
Both. I really like the. I've got more than one color of brown. So, yeah.
Is there yellow cedar bark in the roll? Did you-
No, it's not a Chilkat blanket per se. The raven's tail, the fur, is like the cedar bark. It adds support
Oh, I see.
if you do it right. If you don't do it right, it drags it down. But if you've got it really well taken care of and you have a nice piece of fur, it adds more strength.
Now, where do you find the otter fur these days? Is it vintage?
They're everywhere. They're in Auk Bay now. The sea otters there are rafts of 6,000 floating outside of Sitka. They've been eating originally they transplanted 25 in 1960 from the Aleutians just down Sitka. The first 22 died. The second trip, they kept them really clean. They transplanted 25. And now we have rafts of 3,000 to 6,000 of the darn things. We have no abalone. We're running low on our king crab. The sea urchin business is dead. But that's good because the urchin barrens weren't healthy for the environment. The sea otter are just returning to their environment. There's going to be some yo-yoing. And right now, the population's way too high.
You know, we have the opposite problem. We have in California, the urchins they've eaten all the kelp forests. So they're thinking about introducing them, but they can't, from Monterey Bay, they're happy, but they can't get up past San Francisco where all this problem is because of the sharks. So we're studying to see, they're gonna spend a lot of time studying to see if they should bring them back.
Their usual technique for protection is to hide in the kelp. So without the kelp forests, they are vulnerable to sharks. But once they start clearing out the urchin barrens, the kelp forest comes back.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many urchins, it's a big issue.
The California sea otter were the biggest ones that were on the market back when they were selling them. One sea otter hide sold for 1,200 pounds in London. It was over 6 feet tall. You know, but basically the market was China. If you went to China with sea otters, you didn't have to pay a tax and you could get tea. But if you'd had anything but silver or sea otters, you had to pay a giant tax on your tea. So the merchant ships would come up here, trade for sea otters, and then go to China. So it was, yeah.
What about the yarn? Did you make the yarn, out of the goat or whatever?
I didn't. You're asking about the yarn,
Yeah.
and I used commercial yarn for the weft, and leg spun merino for the warp.
What's Moreo?
Merino is the closest thing you can come to a mountain goat. It's a sheep that was bred for the Spanish nobility, and some of the first encounters with Spanish people, they compared the robes to the same robe, softer than the Spanish nobility had. And they were shocked.
Is it hard to buy or find?
No,
Woven or?
the nobility lost the exclusive right on the sheeps, and they went to New Zealand. Someone took some down there, and now there's a whole bunch of merino sheeps all over the place, and you can get the merino easily. Mountain goat is still really hard to get.
So is it balsa yarn or just the down or the fur part, and you have to do it yourself? Because I was reading in the museum, it takes like 3 months or more just to get from the fur stuff to the yarn. It's really
So you're asking, because you're not at the mic, I'm repeating your question. So you're asking how to make the yarn from the mountain goat into the It is a tedious process which often involves rotting the hide in a stream. You throw it in a clear stream with a rope on it, and as it rots, you can pluck the hair out. But then you have to sort the guard hairs out of it, and it's a kind of a smelly process. Whereas my husband's family had a different method altogether. They traded with the Yukon natives, where the sea otters, or not the sea otters, where the mountain goats rubbed off their fur in the winter would be the same place every year. And so the hunters, the people on the mountain passes would collect the wool and bring it down and trade it for hooligan grease. Yeah. And dry fish and stuff like that they would carry back into the interior. It was a, yeah.
So it's not cheap getting those.
They're not cheap now, they never were.
Wow.
Thank you all very much for coming tonight. I really appreciated it. How Gutes Cheers.